Thank you, Guy. That's very, very generous of you. Thank you very much. Guy, that's very generous indeed. For those of you who know Guy, Guy was in my small group in Windsor. We had 10 days together. Ellen, I think, and Paul also participated in this particular intensive experience of education. And I confess, I don't know if I've ever confessed this to you, Paul, but I will Guy, but I will confess it now. I'll confess to you as well, Paul, but later, Guy, that we spent a long time over those 10 days in small groups, and so that first experience of sitting there as the group facilitator was quite important. And as I cast my eye around, I couldn't quite sort out in my mind what to make of Guy. You probably feel this already. I had known that he'd gone to a particular evangelical college, so part of my prejudice was to pigeonhole him accordingly. But seriously, what emerged was a quiet and genuinely humble person with enormous intellectual capacity to see things and to cut through the grass to get to the heart of the matter. I rather thought of Guy as a silent but deadly person. And I mean that affectionately, genuinely, because most of the clergy I know are silent but boring. So I know which I'd rather have, but so I'm glad to be here. And also I want to say this by way of introduction. The witness of places like St Bride's are absolutely fundamental to the life of the breadth and the diversity of the Church of England and its ministry and mission. And since those Windsor days, Guy, I've kept in touch with the life of the place as far as you can through your social media and your webpage. And I want to say to you, who will maintain and keep this tradition of generosity, of creativity, of inclusivity, and of calling us all into a more risky, interesting hinterland of the spiritual living and being. I want to say to you, I hope that you will keep that tradition alive, and Guy's legacy will be cashed out as the next chapter of St Bride's unfolds. So there we are. I hope you all feel stroked. Careful, just very careful. We haven't had a drink yet for that kind of behaviour, but there we are. Now, what I want to do in the next 35 to 40 minutes or so, that clock's a bit fast, perhaps that's deliberate, is the first thing I've got on the list: affirm the role and place of an inclusive, reflective and outward-looking community. I hope I've done that. The problem with the church is it's too inward-looking. The gravity is too inwards and self-preoccupied, and what you do and witness is a constant pushing outwards towards the world and its shape and its life. The second thing I want to do in this short lecture is to challenge even those of you who are over 55, and there might be a couple of people here who fall into that category. I want to challenge you to think about your own ageism. And I want to try to show that ageism, both in ourselves, at whatever stage of our life and living we're in, is a barrier. And how that ageism takes shape in our community is a political barrier, a justice barrier to building what I would want to call compassionate inclusivity. And anything that is a barrier to that compassionate inclusivity, in the case of this lecture, age and ageism, is always a barrier to growth. And I think it's a particularly interesting connection and bridge between this particular bit of agenda and some writing that Guy has been doing through various mechanisms about liberal churches and church growth. And thirdly, I hope I might be able to be practical, but you'll be the judge of that, in asking how valuing age might teach us something about the nature of discipleship and the nature of our spiritual journeys at every stage of our life. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you a couple of stories, and then I'm going to offer you two pieces of, just going to try and summarize if I can clearly, two pieces of fundamental professional research in the area of gerontology and psychogerontology. The bits of research are much more interesting than that suggests, I promise. And then I want to open the thing up to some questions and challenges about what we learn when we seek intentionally to include older people and their experience within the spiritual economy of our mission and our ministry. So let me tell you two little stories. The first is from 2008, when I happily had a sabbatical in Chicago. If you're going to have a sabbatical, choose interesting places to go to. And I went along to the Science Museum, not actually to see this particular bit of the exhibition, but to look at the architecture of the building as it happens, but bumped into this booth, really, which was rather like one of those booths that used to be in Boots the Chemist, where you had to go to have your passport photograph taken, or when you were young and had more hair and were lively, you went, for me this is about 15 or 16, you went to have your picture taken with the person who you thought you might be marrying. Did you ever do that? You remember kind of trying to squeeze yourself together and get your photograph taken, which became tucked into your wallet or your purse. Anyway, this booth was called Face Aging. A child sits down in front of an automatic camera and their portrait is taken. They wait and their digitized bust appears on a TV monitor. Then, tapping a button like a remote for the television, each child could rapidly call up simulations of what she or he would look like at 1 year intervals. Very extraordinary piece of technology. Up to, but not beyond, the age of 69. Now, I could get into the physical explanation of why that was the case, but that was the cut-off point. So, in seconds, the computer added grotesque pouches, like the one I'm sporting below my square chin. Ready skin and blotches were added to the children's familiar features. Their faces became elongated, then wider, then saggy. Lines became, is this familiar to you? Lines became more heavily rutted. Boys lost hair. Hair turned grey. The heads of both girls and boys grew, then shrunk. I bumped into this and was absolutely transfixed by the responses. "I don't want to get old," said one child, of course in an American accent, while another child commented, unkindly perhaps, on a friend, "Look at her, she's disgusting at 42. Thank you very much, I thought to myself. Now we might come back to that, but I share it because I think it demonstrates the ambivalence at the heart of our relationship with age. Actually, none of us, I think probably the women may be better at this than the men, and there are some gender issues here, of course, but none of us particularly want to spend very, very long periods of time looking at ourselves in the morning in the bathroom mirror. All of us, at one level or other, have quite a complicated relationship to age. And it's that which lies at the root of ageism. That which we fear, we do some very queer things with, to mix up my metaphors. Fearful people build fearful communities where paradox, uncertainty, ambivalence, ambiguity, contradiction are squeezed out of the scenario, and what's embedded are some phobias and prejudices which become so deep-seated as we grow older, they become more and more complex to shift and change. And you as a community, you as human beings, you as a city, as representatives of this city and beyond, might want to reflect about the relationship of fear in and through our seeing and our ability to inhabit some of the paradoxes and ambiguities of living. So there's the first story. The second story is a story against myself, really. Always the most interesting and insightful of stories. I should say, before I went to work at the ecclesiastical version of Legoland, which is Windsor Castle, with Legoland not very far down the road, I was for 11 years the master of some almshouses in Warwickshire, so responsible for looking after older people at every stage of their life, in supported housing, in residential care, and in nursing care. So, and it was there where I began to engage in quite a lot of writing and reflection about this issue. So here's a person who kind of was beginning to get the age thing sorted in their heads. Very dangerous for men who think they're beginning to get things sorted in their heads. Well, sorry, very dangerous for me. I'm sure you're the exception that disproves the rule. So, picture the scene. I have to get into Diocesan Church House for my ministerial development review. And these are the days where, before management and all that kind of stuff hit the Church of England in a big way. Clearly something subconscious was working inside me, because I managed to get in the car probably about 15 minutes later than I should have done, for about a 10 or 11 mile journey into Church House, but through the back end of Solihull and southern Birmingham, where I knew the roads and the shortcuts quite well. So I come down the lane into the main conurbation from the place I worked, which is a place called Knowle. I turn by the church and there's a queue of traffic. And because I'm such a nice, caring, loving, patient person, I began to get very, very agitato. Thinking, this is the last thing I want, what's going on? Why don't they just get a move on? Who is holding me up? I'm about 4 cars away from a pedestrian crossing. And all it requires is for me to shift myself a little bit, and I see an elderly man walking across the pedestrian crossing on a Zimmer frame. And I think to myself, goodness sake, get on with it. You are making me late. It's not a great story against myself, is it? In relation to what I've just said. And he takes forever. I mean, I'm kind of gasping at whether he's going to be able to get the next foot in front of the next foot. Anyway, eventually he crosses. He finds some difficulty moving the Zimmer frame onto the pavement, and the cars begin to pull out. Interestingly, there are people passing him on the pedestrian crossing, and they're not as unpleasant or as impatient as I am, but they reflect a kind of invisibility of this man, for whom that journey across the road was clearly quite a task. One car moves off, the other car moves off, another car moves off. I'm now at least 20 minutes late for the bishop, who actually incidentally was often late himself, but that's another story. Paul will know who I'm talking about. And here's what happens. This is very interesting and challenging. I drive away, conscious of the speed limit, and I look into the mirror, and that man has hardly moved from the edge of the pedestrian crossing. I mean, almost as if he's catching his breath and his energy. And here's the thought that comes into my mind. That man isn't a stranger. That man is me. That man's story of frailty and vulnerability and slowness and aloneness is not detached from my little psychodrama about being late for a meeting where I'm going to tell the bishop what a good job I'm doing. That's the definition of MDR, by the way. I suddenly realise that his story and my story are inextricably bound up. That he is what I will become. And his frailty and vulnerability is already part of my loving and growing and changing and struggling and moving, as it happens, down Knowle High Street not very quickly. And you see, it was very, very surprising that a flash view in the wing mirror of that man still on the pavement brought a collision of the two narratives together, and it was absolutely, completely transformative. And why was it transformative? I mean, I don't know, some of you looking a bit bemused. I don't know if you thought, you think I'd gone completely mad, but there was a spiritual awakening at that particular point, which led me to see that there was some profound connectivity between us, and that what was needed around age and ageism and our life together in an intergenerational community was the realization that all of us, like those children in Chicago, had to befriend the elderly stranger in ourselves. And that's true of all of us, as I've said, whatever stage of living and loving and aging we are. So those are two stories. Hang on to those if you wish. I don't know. We'll see if you make anything of them in a moment. Let me now explain to you two bits of fundamental guiding theory, which will be interesting to see how you connect or otherwise with these two thinkers. But the long and the short of these two thinkers, they're an English writer and researcher and psychogerontologist, just recently retired out of Southampton University, called Peter Coleman, and a Swedish gerontologist called Lars Tornstam, who was writing out of his particular research and experience of retirement communities in Sweden as early actually as the late 70s. What do these two writers have in common? The two writers basically say this: the older we get, the more spiritual we become. So Peter Coleman, over 30 years, interviewed tens of thousands of older people, starting at 40 and going through the whole cycle up to 70. And he mapped out, it's fascinating reading, huge volumes, he mapped out their spiritual lives in their 40s, their 50s, their 60s and their 70s, sometimes a bit later, sometimes a bit earlier. And what he demonstrated, and I don't know if it reflects in your own life, was that the older we get, the more open to the numinous we become, the more ready we are to embrace the non-physical dimension of life in terms of what it looks like, the shape of it, and its meaning. And it led Peter to say that this means that the older generation are the church's natural spiritual constituency, because they have a stronger taste for the spiritual, a stronger awareness of the spiritual than younger people. And it's led me to believe, I usually say this when there's an archdeacon present, or an archdeacon in waiting, this means that we should sack all youth workers whose ministry is largely a triumph of process over content, and we should employ people to engage in older people, because older people are our natural spiritual constituency. And the reason for this? Very, very straightforward. Although Peter did take 4 volumes to describe the thesis. He said people become more spiritual, A, because they're closer to death than they are birth, and that focuses the mind. And secondly, post 55 he uses, but it's an arbitrary cut-off point, the older we get, the more cognizant we are of how much we've messed up in our lives. And that those two realities give us a stronger sense of the spiritual. Now, the fascinating thing, I mean, and this links in with a lot of these modernity lectures, is how you translate that sense of the numinous, that sense of the spiritual, into some religious narrative which is liberating and meaningful and important. So, let me now move to Lars Tornstrom, who talks about this in a rather wonderful phrase. You can tell this to your friends at the pub tomorrow night. He calls these moments gero-transcendence. I think it's a rather interesting, and I'm just going to map out, because I can't hold all of these in my head, but I'm just going to map out the main findings from Tornstrom's, again, very substantial piece of work. And this came from observing people in retirement communities over a long period of time. The first thing that Tornstrom says is that, and I've indicated this from Coleman's work, is that there's a certain amount of self-confrontation occurs. You know, when you get to my age, you can't run away from how much of a shit you are sometimes. Just excuse the French. We better edit that out, Malcolm, if that's possible. And then actually that self-confrontation makes one realise how flawed and fragile and complex and wonderful we are as human beings. And this is a process of discovery that reveals often previously hidden aspects of the self, which are both good and bad. And that leads to a certain sense of transcendence. Interestingly, as well, Tornstrom argues that there's a decrease in older people in self-centeredness, with an increasing awareness that the individual is not at the centre of the universe, and there is a change from egoism to altruism. And I think this is very interesting around how we view older people in relation to the growth or otherwise of the churches. Thirdly, and I've been enjoying this recently with a recent visit home, as you get older there is a rediscovery of childhood and a pleasure of recalling episodes from one's childhood, and that's caused one of two of you to smile. It's also incidentally why older people are much better with children than parents are. Grandparents are much, much better at the delight in their grandchildren than sometimes their parents are. Let me go on and just then map out for Thornstone what this means in terms of relationships. Thornstone says that older people have an increased need for solitude, and that one of the things that religion needs to offer people is an ability to live with that silence and that solitude and that reflectiveness, and that older people become much less bothered about lots of relationships and become highly selective about which friendships and relationships really, really matter. There's a distinction that happens between the self and the role. This is true of almost every human being apart from clergy people. Thirdly, attitudes to wealth change. There's less desire to go shopping and a greater sense that possessions can ensnare and confine a person. Fourthly, and I suspect as I look round the group beyond my specs, this is modelled in some of you, people who get older and go with the flow become more outrageous. They become Helen, I know this is really difficult to imagine in your case, but I mean, this is going to happen in the next 10 years. There's a real joy in breaking the boundaries and transcending nonsensical social norms. And fifthly, and this is why we need to listen to older people when it comes to the ethical debate. Older people have a much stronger sense of the ambiguity and the paradox of life, and a much stronger ability not to be binary in their thinking around splitting absolute right from absolute wrong. Thornston discovered this, but I've not discovered this from some of the older church people I know. He says this is accompanied by an increasing reluctance to give advice to others. Now I think these theories are really, really important. This picks up some of your work, Guy. It picks up some of the work of Linda Woodhead. I think we take too much for granted about what people believe. And I think we take too much for granted about how people come to believe what they believe. And the interesting thing that links Thornston's and Coleman's work is this, and this is the phrase, that when people become older in relation to this pattern and texture that I'm describing, they come to believe less more intensely. And that certainly bears out some of my experience. And I think in terms of this city, in terms of the model and witness of this church, older people become very powerful advocates for social justice. So, what does this mean? It's all right. I'm kind of coming to the end. So, it reminds me of a very naughty clergyman at a Birmingham. No, in Oxford, and this is 25 years ago actually, Oxford Diocesan Conference guy, when I was there, and George Carey was talking. Do you remember the days of George? He's still talking. We're all still talking. And he was having a real go at David Jenkins, who had ordained me deacon and priest in the 80s. So I was rather feeling a bit defensive about this. But of course, I was too well behaved to want to stand up and challenge this. I think David Jenkins got people to talk about God in a way that, we need to bring it on, actually, in so many, many ways. And others will write about this. But there was a wonderfully naughty clergy person who was sat in front of me who just summed it up. He buried his head in his hands and said really loudly, "Oh God, please make him stop." So let me offer one or two pointers, and then you need to tell me what it looks like from your perspective. What might it mean for us to value age and embrace it within our spiritual landscape? An American sociologist said this, and I think it's a profoundly hopeful assertion. She said this: "It has been widely said that whatever many may say about the future, it is ours. Not only that it may happen to us, but it is in part made by us." And so if the landscape of age and aging feels to be unsatisfactory in the way we treat older people, in the way we treat older people socially, in the way we treat older people economically, in the way we marginalise and make invisible older people within our religious communities. That need not be the final note or message to the shape of what is emerging, because you can make an enormous difference by and through your desire to want to combat and engage with the shape that ageism takes both in yourself and in other people. So I want to say this to you, to each one of you. What might it mean to become a radical activist for older people? And make no bones about this, this is a call to arms. This is a call to struggle. This is a call to both church and society to say that older people need valuing. We need to engage with the spiritual geography of older people. We need to be more explicit about the way in which age is taking shape in us in order to reform and transform what is for many, many older women and men in this society, let alone other communities and societies, a very unhappy, marginalising and lonely and poor experience. I mean, this has been an economic challenge to consistent governments since the 1970s, of whatever political shade they are in, that we know, given the increased demography, we know that given the increased longevity of older people in our generation, we know those facts, yet seem reluctant to want to organise ourselves in order to ensure good care for them at every level in the health and social care economy. So, who will be the advocates for older people in this community, in our society? That's the first rather broad issue. The second issue, if we're to take seriously, and if it's rung any bells with you, the idea that the imaginative spiritual horizons of older people become richer and textured and wiser, then we need to do something about the predominant paradigm within which we are all locked when we think about and feel about age. So if we were to have a flip chart, God forbid, and I were to map out what most immediately came to your mind when you think about aging, I would reckon that predominantly, but not but not exclusively, we'd come up with words like diminishment. We'd come up with words like decline. We'd come up with words like death. That the predominant narrative that we're locked into, and particularly the church, for older people, is a negative narrative. What can we do to reshape a more positive spiritual narrative where aging can be rediscovered as a sense of journey, a sense of legacy making, a time of integration, a time of adventure and self-discovery, a time of self-revelation, and a time within which we can go deeper into the wells of love, of God, of the Christian tradition, and from those wells share the wisdom of living an authentic and honest and loving Christian life. It is the most paradoxical issue of our times that we now have the extraordinary ability to prolong life, yet at the same time marginalise and fail to listen to and to celebrate the lives of older people and how God has rooted herself in those lives, and how through that rootedness so much fruit is born in and through their loving and praying and serving and faithful witness to a kind of world that they would wish us and a new generation to live in. So there's something about social justice in relation to the system. There's something about the reshaping of a narrative of age and older people. And so, just to give you two examples of that before I offer one final thought, and then I will shut up. In the church press, whenever statistics are articulated, there is some profound negative narrative at work around older people. Often, if the church press want to have a picture associated with what I would call the decline narrative, it will be of an older person. Now, the subliminal message there is that this is the generation that somehow is to blame for the decline. That whenever our church leaders talk about the last chance saloon, and if we don't do something radical now, the church will be over, there are some interesting and complex inferences around the generation that have kept the faith alive, around the generation that have continued to serve, to engage, to sustain buildings, to allow their gospel convictions to spill out into corporate and communal action. I think the ageism of the statistical narrative in the church is very shocking and needs challenging. So, finally, what have older people taught me about theology? I'm just going to offer you two or three very brief thoughts. I think that the process of aging reshapes our relationship to time. I think older people ask us, both implicitly and explicitly, to slow up, to be less distracted, to pay attention, to find the infinite worth of God's love in being, as well, of course, as doing. You know, when I look at my nephews and nieces, I worry a lot about the way in which individualism and materialism and consumerism, at the pace it's going, distort and disfigure what time can mean for them in terms of human well-being and flourishing. So that is the first element to a healthy Christian community will always, I think, have within it elders and elder wisdom. I mean, I suppose that's a very obvious thing to say, but I think it needs saying. I think the second element is that older people, and this is tough, show us what it's like to live with human vulnerability, with human boundedness, and with human limitation. And you know, I think that's one of the toughest lessons around. I think the irony and paradox of the realization that to be set free, we need to be able to embrace our fragility and our lack of capacity and our desire, deep desire, to feel, and in feeling, mourn and cry. I don't think as individuals or as families or as communities we cry enough for the things that we want to be different, for the things that haven't gone wrong, for the hurts that we've experienced, for the way life perhaps hasn't dealt us the hand of cards that we would have liked. And so I think that's the second area that, you know, it isn't about strength, it isn't about delivery, it isn't about targets, it isn't about where I bought my suit from, it isn't about essentially any of those things. I think it's about something much deeper and profounder and fragile and precious. And it's getting worse, I'm sorry, but I promise I'm nearly finished. I think the third area which I would want to articulate is that older people teach us how to die. Older people teach us how to cope with change and loss and how to let go. Let go of our ego, let go of our self-importance, let go of our record collection, let go of all those books, let go of, I mean, you fill in the gap. There's something about human beings fully set free which always embraces that unique spiritual charism of being ready to let go and to die and to let be. And that, I think, again, is a profoundly radical and countercultural element within the spiritual and theological economy of our life together. There we go. I promise that clock is early, but I have wandered a little bit, but I think that's enough. I'm very grateful for your listening, and it's over to you. I'm ready for you to crack the whip and yes, sir.